Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to our next lecture where we are looking at the undisputed letters of Paul. In this case, we're going to look at Second Corinthians. We, of course, looked already at First Corinthians, but now let's look at Second Corinthians. So with the date in the audience, you're not really going to see a whole lot of difference between First Corinthians and Second Corinthians. Second Corinthians written about a year after First Corinthians, so dates of around 56 to 57 CE/AD. So about a year after First Corinthians, same audience, Jewish and Gentile Christians. The audience isn't really going to change much in 1 year's time. So look at the structure of the letters. There's a reason for that, and the body of Christ. Historians, they universally agree that Second Corinthians appears to be two letters, at least two letters, combined together, edited together, where chapters 1 through 9 form one letter, chapters 10 through 13 form a second letter. However, there are some historians that have argued that Second Corinthians is more than just two letters placed together. So you have universal agreement among historians that chapters 1 through 9 form one letter. And the reason why is because at the end of chapter 9, you have a closing, which would indicate the end of the letter. And so chapters 10 through 13 form a second letter. However, you do have some historians that think that Second Corinthians is more than just two letters. I've seen before arguments that chapter 8 seems to be its own letter because of the rhetorical, tone in the letter. And as I was, preparing for this lecture and looking at the last chapter, chapter 13, it struck me that it could be its own letter just because of the rhetoric from it. And kind of relating here to the body of Christ, if someone causes pain to one of you, it affects all of you. So essentially, if one member of the body of Christ is affected, all members end up being affected. But was Paul perhaps referring to himself in a passage here in Second Corinthians? Paul mentions an individual, he doesn't give any names in these particular verses as someone who, upset, did damage to the church community and how he needs to be forgiven. But I do wonder if Paul was possibly referring to himself in that passage because in the opening of chapter 2, he happens to make this statement. For if I caused you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? That perhaps Paul may have actually been asking for potential forgiveness. I mean, if he was referring to another individual, then that person has been lost to history. But looking at the contents, the context of the letter here, it does seem to come across that he could have been referring to himself at that point. Our work is not hidden. We do not need a letter of recommendation. You are our letter of recommendation. There is the famous idiom, how the proof is in the pudding. And basically, the understanding of that statement is all one has to do is to try the pudding and they'll see just how good it is. And what Paul is getting at here is something very similar. He doesn't need letters of recommendation. The community in Corinth alone is a letter of recommendation. His work there is, and the proof of that work is a letter of recommendation. We are not veiled, unlike Moses and the Torah. Again, he is essentially getting at his work is not hidden. It's not, we don't hide anything. Everything is here to be seen. And he, in many respects, takes a swipe here at Moses and the Torah. And what he's referring to is um, in the book of Exodus, when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, the Israelites can't look at his face because he's been in contact, excuse me, with God. So what Moses does is he covers his face with a veil so people can have conversations with him. And it's a pretty odd, use, taking a swipe in many respects of the Torah. And to say something about Paul regarding criticisms of him, I'm going to reference in the letter to the Romans issues regarding Paul and homosexuality. But I've heard before the statement that Paul, in his attitude towards homosexuality, that Paul was an angry, closeted homosexual. I don't agree with that. Now, in terms of his attitude towards the Torah, many commentators, historians have pointed out that Paul seems to be a disgruntled Jew. That I could go along with because his reference to Moses here is really, to advance his case, it's kind of an odd reference, but it's certainly, taking a swipe against Moses, even though it's really hard to be critical on that because Moses has to cover his face because he's been in contact with God and his face is so illuminated people can't look at it, but he's been close to God, which is why. Moving forward, we do not act unethically. If someone cannot see our message, then someone is preventing that person from doing so. Paul has been accused in Corinth of acting unethically, and his response to this is we don't act unethically. Our message is there to be seen. It's right out there in the open. We're not hiding it. We're not like Moses in this case. And if someone cannot see our message, then someone is preventing them from doing so. And a part of me thought when I was looking at that of referencing John Calvin and his teaching on predestiny, but I think that I'll save that for another time. And kind of emphasizing the point of ethics, right actions, our work slash, excuse me, slash actions are proof of our ethicalness. So how is it that we're acting ethically? We'll just look at our works, look at our actions. There's proof right there. And we don't hide them. We do them all out in the open. Everybody can see them. Again, we're not like Moses with the veil over his face. So a little bit here with Paul versus the super apostles, as Paul calls them. First off, who were the super apostles? We don't know exactly who they were. No names are given, but they arrived sometime after Paul left Corinth. Paul does reference them being Jewish. So we don't know exactly who they were, but Paul references them being Jewish. What do they say about Paul? Well, apparently, they mocked his speaking ability and his appearance, but on a positive note, they did say that he was a good letter writer. And what qualities they do have, they apparently like to boast about. And Paul has contempt for that. So, to a certain degree, they engaged in ad hominem attacks against Paul, making fun of his speaking ability and his appearance, although they did say he's a good letter writer. Um, and Paul states that they like to boast about themselves. Paul has contempt for that. And, he says, I don't boast about myself, although then he does start, making boasts about himself and what he's had to go through. What exactly did they teach? Paul, he doesn't specifically mention what they taught, but other than to say that their gospel is different from his own. But given their background, the chances are good that they were probably Ebionites slash adoptionists. So the chances are good they would have been those that Paul refers to as the Judaizers, essentially individuals that held that the death of Christ did away with the sinful offerings of the Torah, the law, but that other elements of the Torah, such as circumcision, need to be maintained, which would be totally against what Paul argues in favor of. In the end, Paul declares that these individuals are not true apostles in doctrine or in their attitude, but that his weaknesses, from their perspective, are what makes him a true apostle. So Paul, he declares that these individuals, they're not true apostles in what they teach or in their boastful attitude, but that the weaknesses that they basically state he has, um, from Paul's perspective, those weaknesses are what makes him a true apostle, and he decides to actually do a little boasting where he boasts about them, his weaknesses. Well, that's essentially all that we have for Second Corinthians. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Until then, take care.